Leading with Culture is brought to you by Maslow Leadership. Visit maslowleadership.com.
Welcome to the Leading with Culture podcast. This is your host, Timothy Tiryaki. Today I will be talking to Tammy Arseneau, Vice President of Suncor's Talent and Culture Unit. Suncor Energy is Canada's leading integrated energy company with 10,000 plus employees around the world. Tammy has worked for Suncor for just over 10 years and is currently Vice President, Talent and Culture. In this role, she is part of the Human Resources Organization and is accountable for driving, integrating, and accelerating a Suncor-wide international and strategic culture transformation. Tammy is responsible for working across the enterprise to define and embed the desired culture and for ensuring people are ready for the changes that comes with the transformation. Tammy's prior experience includes VP HR Strategic Partners, as well as several years as part of the organizational effectiveness team. Prior to joining Suncor, Tammy spent more than 20 years in oil and gas and consulting within Canada and overseas. She has an MBA from the Henley Management Business School based in the UK with a special focus on business transformation, culture, and leadership. In her free time, she enjoys watching her 3 boys play baseball, football, and hockey. Life at the cottage is also an important part of the Arseneau family time. And let's move on to our interview at Leading with Culture. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of Leading with Culture. And today I'm interviewing Tammy Arseneau. Tammy, it's so great to see you.
Hi, Tim. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. How are you doing on the West Coast? We're dealing with a heat wave. How are things over there?
Things are well here in Calgary. I just got back from vacation after 2 weeks. So we're having nice weather. I wouldn't call it a heat wave, but certainly relaxed. It's post stampede for us too. So things are nice and quiet.
Wonderful. At a program last week, we welcomed many participants from Alberta, and I heard great news about the stampede of this year. So wonderful. Once more, welcome. I look forward to this conversation. And you and I have had great conversations in the previous years as part of projects where I had a chance to work together with you on transformation. And a lot of, on some ends, like strategic, philosophical discussions, but also very practical application-based and learning from the actual project. So I was looking forward to this session to bring your experience, your very valuable experience with many of our listeners who are mostly in the HR realm or leaders that want to bring in culture to their practice. We talk a lot about transformation, and I hope to cover that today. But as a starting point, why don't you tell us just a little bit about your background of 20 plus years of work experience, mostly in HR, but tell us about your story from your end.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Yes. Let's see if I remember it all after 20 plus years. Thank you for being kind. I have an undergrad in HR. So I took a human resources bachelor degree, but when I started work, I didn't actually go directly into HR. So I was really into other aspects of business, internal audit, finance, accounting, and I do actually recommend that as a good path to understand the business. So it gave me a great opportunity to understand the business differently. I spent some time post that in consulting in New Zealand and did that for a few years. So I did that for a couple of years, and that's when I really started to get back into human resources or organizational effectiveness in that realm. The time I spent in the business, and it didn't matter which department it was in, it was all about people. Right, whether you're in accounting or finance or capital management or internal audit, it was all about people and training or them understanding the expectations of their role. So at some point when I was in New Zealand, decided I worked for a consulting firm and really wanted to get back into it because I wanted to know more. I wanted to deepen my knowledge. I had an undergrad in HR, but I actually hadn't spent time in the working world. So consulting gave me that opportunity to see a number of different companies, a different culture, and then deepen my knowledge in the HR practices. So that's really where I went. After that, after I spent some time consulting in New Zealand, I came back to Canada and really wanted to continue around understanding how companies move from point A to point B, let's say. So how do you take a strategy of an organization and espouse vision or a purpose statement or where an organization wants to go? And then how do you actually get there? How do you enable the people and empower people to get there? So I was just fascinated about the whole system of an organization and how does that happen? So I did a master's degree. It was an MBA, but what we really focused on was on strategy execution. I found a lot of, MBAs that I'm aware of focus on the development of the strategy, but this degree really focused on the execution. And to no surprise, again, a lot of it was around leadership, change management, but understanding how all the components of the organization need to line up. So it was really around the strategy execution. So I really geeked out on that degree, and then started to apply that in different companies, in the East Coast in New Brunswick, and then here in Calgary. And I've been here for the last 11 years.
Well, thank you for sharing. Well, I've heard this from quite some other HR leaders as well, in terms of the benefit of having business operations experience, consulting operations, a consulting experience, and how that benefits the HR, and especially the strategy side you mentioned. You're bringing the HR 2.0 and even I know the HR 3.0 perspective. So I'd like to talk about that a bit, and how there's this discussion on how HR is further evolving. HR 1.0, the early histories of HR, more personnel management, labor relations, evolving to HR 2.0, strategy and business partners, and now HR 3.0 with people and culture advisors and transformation. But what are your thoughts on the evolution of HR as an HR leader yourself?
I think it's really exciting that we're moving away from, like you mentioned, personnel to human resources to actually kind of about people, right? There's something just real about that conversation about people work in organizations. We are what makes the organization run. So to really understand and unpack what motivates people, how do you develop people? How do you motivate them? How do you develop, train, reward, compensate? Like those things are all fascinating to me because it drives behavior. So that evolution to think about people within an organization, not to think about them as an asset or a resource, is so important. And I think we're continuing to evolve in that way. I think the pandemic has also influenced that. The new generations coming into the workforce, people just want to have real conversations. People are reflected on who they are, and they want to have real conversations and be real in an organization. We talk a lot about diversity and inclusion, and do people feel included? Can they be themselves as they enter an organization? So to have this group or department that went from personnel to HR to now focusing on people so they can bring themselves to work every day and be the best performers they can to drive performance in an organization is exciting to me and necessary.
Yes, and your organization is I know it's leading that edge as well. So you're the VP of transformation of a global organization, and I love talking about the difference of change and transformation. Now, we've been seeing change management for decades now, more incremental change versus transformation, this bigger step happening. And so in your thought, in what ways are they different?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I'm I was part of the transformation, but I looked after specifically the people and culture part of the transformation. I didn't look after, let's say, the digital side of it or the other aspects, process or systems. So just to be clear, there was this great quote that I saw, and it was from Brian Cunningham. And he talks about the difference between change management, let's say, or change and transformation is change makes things different. Transformation makes us different. Mm-hmm. So it's a more foundational and fundamental change an organization has to take. It's rethinking who you are, your purpose, who you are as an organization, and how you do work. And even further than that, I think it tests underlying assumptions and beliefs. So the way you've always done something now is challenged to say, can we do it differently? Should we do it differently? And here's why. And thinking about the future and not always based on what's been done in the past. So transformation is a more personal and profound reflection on what an organization is, who it is. And that's the transformation where it changes, maybe aspects of that.
Wonderful. Yeah. So the change management is more of the process, but transformation management is more of the people transformation and the culture transformation. And also strategy. I find transformation to bring and have more strategic transformation as well. So you mentioned pillars of transformation. Yes, there's digital, there's systems and process, and people and culture. Organizations usually see transformation and change only as the process, the digital part, but you're tackling the people and culture part as well. So any comments on the importance of the people and culture aspect of the whole transformation mandate?
Yeah, it's like a Venn diagram. I'm sure they all overlap and at different points in time in the transformation are more pronounced. But what we do know for sure is that you can give anybody a new tool or a new process, but unless they understand what's expected of them or the processes or the behaviors, or even challenging some of the assumptions and beliefs, as I mentioned, which ultimately impact culture, if you don't have that alongside at any point, or at least be aware. So culture is the outcome of many of those things. But being intentional and aware that that is an enabler to the change that you're trying to achieve through the, whether it's a new tool, a new technology, a new process is really important. And I think it's an evolution of where we were before as collectively as a practice.
Exactly. Well, to kind of conclude that part of change and transformation, my mantra, which I love sharing, is that I see change as an ongoing evolution, but transformation is the revolution. It's that large step in strategy and people and culture transformation. So this relates a lot to the changing leadership and organizational paradigm of the 21st century. And of course, when we're going through it, we don't acknowledge as much, like the 20th century is different than the 19th century. And of course, we're going through another round of change. And I know both of us, we like the language of the from to thinking, like what's changing from before, the previous from, the to now. And in one of our conversations, you talked about this, I'm not sure what the term was, but a currency, a new type of currency of what was it, the employees' attention? Or could you talk about that? What's changing there? Or some other from, I'm going to move towards some other from tos from there as well.
Yeah, sure. I don't know if it's coming out of the pandemic and what we've learned in the pandemic or post, but I'm sure that's a huge influence. But also the new generations coming into the workforce value something different than what I did and what, my predecessors did coming into the workforce and what success meant to them. So what we're finding now is the new currency is flexibility. Mm-hmm. It's not the corner office. It may not be the title. It may not be, all the bricks and mortar type thing that a traditional, somebody who's been in the workforce a long time defined as success. But flexibility we're finding is the new currency to define success. My organization gives me flexibility to have work-life balance. I'm able to have a better life. I think we've all had a lot of time to reflect on who we want to be and was this the life we wanted to live. Pandemic gave us all that pause and that opportunity to do that. So for those reasons, we're seeing a real shift in what people value in their work and personal lives, and that is flexibility.
Mm-hmm. A new currency, the currency of flexibility. That's very interesting. It makes a lot of sense. Well, what are some other from tos you're observing, maybe at high level in terms of organizational paradigm and leadership thinking? And what would you like to continue seeing in large organizations?
It's probably along the same line. Like we've talked a lot about trust and what does that mean? And how do you build trust, which is a foundation of relationship. You don't have trust if you're not building a personal relationship. So I do think that what we're seeing more and more of is the need, and I also mentioned in the diversity and inclusion, the need for people to be able to show up at work and be themselves. I think that's a change. Rather than from and you show up at work and you assimilate to the work and the culture and you leave your home life or your personal beliefs aside, organizations are becoming more and more personal. Individual, personal views are being expressed more and more. The need to feel included and be able to express those views. And then the trust that goes both ways. So it's not just, okay, do this work, employee A, B, or C. There has to be mutual trust built between the employee and the leader. Like, why am I doing this? What is the purpose? And to why I'm doing this, and to what value, what purpose is my work? And we are noticing that as well. People are changing careers more and more often. People have choice in how they want to spend their time. So to have an organization which aligns with their personal values is really important. We're finding that being a purpose-driven organization and to have people who are part of that organization because they align to the purpose is really important, and that they have meaning in their work. So they want feedback. They want connection. They want the trust to be there, but that is earned in an organization, which requires more communication, more leadership, less traditional forms of what we had thought previously. So that is an evolution that we're seeing more and more as well.
So it's a part of the changing leadership paradigm as well, from this more hierarchical command control, more linear thinking leadership. We're moving towards a more trust-based caring type of leadership. So yes, well said. And trust is a critical component of that. Now, in our research of looking into the changing employee experience and employee needs in the post-COVID era, and going back to this Maslowian framework, which we revised for the 21st century, we were able to tier three main levels: basic needs at work, psychological needs at work, and growth needs at work. And we found that trust was showing up at all three levels in terms of different thinking. So like when people are given the basic tools, technology, onboarding, training, basic pay, physical well-being, like that was a basic level of trust. And then building on that, this psychological level of trust, of inclusion, collaboration, learning, appreciation. And the third level was, again, as you mentioned, the embodiment of purpose, empowerment of people, and coaching and mentoring of others. So it's interesting to think about how trust shows up at many different ways and many different layers. And any thoughts on that, on how trust and employee experience relate to each other?
Absolutely. I couldn't describe it better than you. That's why I'm pausing, because the way you define that, describe that is exactly right. And it's what we're experiencing. Maybe on the flip side, Tim, to take a different vein, although we talk about trust, what is the challenge on the other end in a traditional perspective, or different leaders were making this change, perhaps on the flip side, is that people sometimes confuse those things of trust or employee experience or the work-life balance with a lack of accountability, right? It's not holding people accountable. It's, that command and control. So, there's situational leadership. There's time for certain types of leadership, as we all know. So it doesn't mean blind trust. It doesn't mean blind employee experience at the expense of the business. And I just think that's fascinating. So I like how you described it in an organization and what defines trust. And I would say that's, the experience. I love the hierarchy, the Maslow hierarchy. I'm also equally fascinated that we see things as an or, right? If you have trust, then you cannot have accountability. And, I was doing some research earlier around, and I also found this quote, which I love. I like these quotes that are so insightful as well. And that, trust cannot thrive without accountability. Very good points. Yes. And usually leaders fall in a typical dualistic thinking of, you're either people focus or you're performance focus, but it's a both and. How can we both and that really bringing those two concepts together. It's actually just adding the dimension, like being high on people focus and high on performance focus. But of course, that's a challenging topic, because it's not as easily done. And maybe you can help us understand some of the best practices of trying to move towards building both people focus and performance focus from an HR leader standpoint. So what are some best practices to move an organization towards that? We are in that process. So I'm not sure if they're best practice, Tim, but these are certainly things that we're trialing and testing. So one is, you have to be clear on the expectations that you have with anybody or anything. Like what do we want for a culture? What does it mean? What do we expect of our people? So being clear on that is really, really important. So what are our expectations? The second thing is education. Like we said, the duality. So here are ways that you can continue to build trust with people and each other, and here's how you do it. So I think it's really important. And often people can be afraid or fearful, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, because they don't feel equipped. Mm-hmm. So I think with all the compassion in the world and understanding, education is important. And I think that's the root to most things in our world, is education. So that I would say is a best practice. And giving people examples that they can practice in their job. So this is how you might hold somebody accountable. Here's the impact, and here's how you would develop trust. It could be a checklist, for certain first-time leaders. Have you talked to your people today? Have you asked them how they're doing? Do you understand, their life as much as they want to share with you outside of work? Do you understand their work? Do you understand some of their challenges? So it could be just basic, things that you should do if you're not a natural at building relationships and building trust with people. So those are some of the things. So education, clear expectations, and ongoing feedback. I do like the notion around testing your own assumptions and beliefs and how you need to trust first. And again, what I mean by that is not the blind trust, but am I trusting in their capability of, the people that report to me? Am I open? Am I listening to them? So those would be other areas that I would say is just being mindful and self-aware of your own assumptions and beliefs as you build a relationship.
And it takes a lot of self-awareness for a leader to question their own assumptions, their own behaviors. And we don't see it as often. Of course, one of our roles as coaches, executive coaches, leadership coaches, is to help them to challenge those assumptions. Exactly. Now, I'll bring one quote, and one of my favorite is that remembering to hold people first capable and also accountable, but just holding people capable, believing in their capabilities and trusting them is a step that precedes holding them accountable. So those are great reminders. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Leading with Culture. Many leaders are expected to manage culture, but are not equipped to lead with culture. At Maslow, we provide culture analytics, culture training, and coaching on how to lead with culture. In other words, we provide research and data-driven culture and leadership transformation. Our corporate programs include research in the design, where we measure the pre and post impact of our leadership and coaching programs. We have 3 pillars of our work. Number 1, culture transformation. Our research on the changing employee needs in the post-COVID era created a brand new approach called culture actualization. The employee engagement measures and systems we're currently using were designed 10 to 20 years before and are not capturing the needs of this post-COVID era. Leadership development. Leading with Culture and Leader as a Coach are our signature programs helping leaders on this next chapter. Number 3, coaching. We develop large-scale corporate coaching programs and offer ICF-accredited coach certifications. Reach out to us to get more information at maslowleadership.com.
Now, your organization, the way I think like many of the HR leaders and organizations across the world, across industries, they're struggling with transformation management. And I study the literature. I work with great companies like yours as well as I had a chance to. And what I saw as some best practice evolving is to come up with transformation strategy, transformation principles, and building the transformation process, bringing together the right team. And I know that your organization also brought together like the best across, but there is something different about transformation management as a project. So any other maybe last tips or practice for other HR leaders thinking to start transformation management if they haven't already?
Transformation takes a long time. So, being realistic about the pace and the amount of change. And, the hardest thing with anything is we all lose sight in the day-to-day. So we'll lose sight of the vision or the purpose or, sometimes things that have a quick start and finish are easier to stay focused on it. But when transformation takes a long time, you have to be mindful of that, the magnitude of that change, the time it takes to do it, and that we get distracted with things. So the constant reminder, reinforcement, and when you do things, reminding and connecting it. This is why we did this thing. It might look small, but it is part of the transformation, and keeping track of that, and being mindful and keeping track of the resource. And I said not to say that earlier. The people, yes. The people impact, and that our capacity to absorb change is a lot lower than I think what we think change and transformation can happen quickly, but we know that. And, we use examples like habit forms, try to change a habit, which is a transformation for many people because habits are very hard to change. How long does that take? A significant amount of time. So if you think an organization is a group of people with habits that you're trying to change, it takes a very long time. And we often underestimate the amount and the pace.
Exactly. And it's important to remind that it's a 3 to 5 year process. And I think the challenge or the paradox is while holding the 3 to 5 year vision, but keep acting upon it now. And it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back sometimes. And sometimes there are wins, sometimes there are losses, but it's a journey. It's a process. That's a very good reminder to keep communicating, broadcasting the journey. And it's full of paradoxes. I love this article that came out in Harvard Business Reviews, I believe January, February 2022. And it talks about the paradox mindset. And that's something I've been reading about. And many leaders know about the growth mindset, the learner's mindset, but few know about the paradox mindset. And the research body of that looks into how people that could hold paradoxes, just like this idea of let's sleep through this, let's hold on to these conflicting forces acting upon us and just have reflection and dialogue. So staying in the paradox, they showed more resilience, more creativity. And so what are your thoughts on that and how it relates to, I don't know, what's happening these days?
I love that. I have two articles beside me. One is polarity management and the other one is the both and leadership. And we just spoke to that as a leadership team and group. And it is a very important skill and awareness to have and a mindset to have. And I would say that is a growing and increasing expectation of all leaders, in any facet, whether it's in organizations or the world is more complex. The rate of change is more complex. The speed and pace is increasing. I think we could do things at a lower pace, lower complexity in the past, and you can hold on to one thing for a long time, like whether it's centralization. So we all know this whole debate around centralize or decentralizing an organization. I think that's one example that's in the article. And we used to be able to do that for a number of years, and all companies would decentralize and then they would centralize, and all companies do it and they all go through the cycle. What's fascinating now is that organizations have to balance too. They can't fully centralize like we used to or fully decentralize because neither one is right. And the article talks about how you have to have that tension and be able to manage the tension. And that's the job of a leader as an example. And probably on a personal level, I always think about, my kids are going to hate that I'm talking about them, but I have teenage boys, and the tension and the paradox and the both and, they're still kids and they need to, learn to be adults, and managing that tension. There's not one right or wrong, but even as a parent, trying to balance that. It's just a skill that we all need to develop and sharpen.
Exactly. And that HPR article was also talking about several of the existing paradoxes. One of them was that one you mentioned. So being like a globally minded thinker, but also locally thinking. So is it which one? It's both and. It's not either or, both and. So I remember when we had a chance to work in the project 2-3 years ago, I remember how you were constantly on the forefront of articles and books. And so is it okay if you mention, so what are those books or articles, the both and thinking, or is it a book or an article? Just giving us the names maybe?
Yeah, it's an article. It's a Harvard Business Review article. It's both and leadership. And it's called Spotlight on Managing for an Unpredictable Future.
Okay.
May 2016. So it's not even new, 6 years ago, let's say. And then the other one is, again, this one's fascinating to me because it's 1998, June 1998. Polarity Management, a summary introduction. So Barry Johnson, PhD, September 1998, talks about polarity management. This is the one where he talks about centralized decentralization. So I don't think they're new concepts. I think they're old concepts in a new paradigm or a new context or a new world. But I think it's fascinating that we're talking more of it now. And I think we just need that skill more now than ever. But people have been talking about it for some time. Well,
it's great how you're role modeling, you and your team, lifelong learning and informed, like bringing in research knowledge into your practice, which is a good segue into culture as well. Like those are some culture practices that you're clearly role modeling yourself. I'd like to talk about the idea of culture, just tapping into your knowledge of culture. And I had this discussion with business unit leaders, HR leaders, this idea of culture management, leading with culture. And leaders are struggling with the idea of having an overarching corporate culture and local subculture. So what are your thoughts on how to manage the corporate culture and subculture? Is it okay or not, or how to manage them?
Yeah, this is my personal view on this one. So overall culture of an organization, and we define it based on a set of values. So what do we believe in? What is the purpose, and what do we believe in? And those beliefs determine how we act, behave, and the processes in which we're developing. And we're in the process. So there's no way that we're saying, we've achieved the desired culture that we want, but that's underway. So I think that's one thing, is just defining it. And you need to find the anchor in which you define your culture. So being clear on that. And you talked about culture management. I always talk about it being intentional about your culture. Like your culture is going to happen whether you want it to or not. It's just making the choice, the deliberate choice to be intentional about the culture that you want and working towards it and being intentional about it. In terms of the subcultures linked to a corporate culture, this is going to be a really, I think, in analogies and quotes, as you can tell. So my analogy, I always think about, McDonald's works a certain way. But when you go in, and I just came back from vacation in New Brunswick, I go into a McDonald's in New Brunswick and they might have lobster rolls. Well, they don't have lobster rolls in Calgary. I don't know what they have because I don't go to McDonald's very often. But the point is, even an organization that is very, let's say, rigid on process, who they are, what they produce, their menus, they still have a bit of local flavor. They still allow for a little bit of local flavor, but it's completely tied to the principles in which they set. And I think that's the same, should be true. I think that's the personality. So as long as in the subcultures, you're tied to the common beliefs and values and then processes and systems, it's okay to have your flavor, right? Like your own flavor, your certain things that make you unique. It's not a divergent. If you had completely different beliefs and that was your subculture, I would say, okay, that's not on. But if you fundamentally believe in the same things, you're aligned with the culture, if your company is one in which has, standard practices and processes and you adhere to that, I think that's okay. But if you have a unique flair, different, way in which that comes to life, that's okay. We're not robots. This is where it's about, having a little bit of that feeling included and bringing your personality to the table as an area inside the company is okay.
Exactly. Well, my corporate kind of formative experience origins are from Procter & Gamble and Intel, and I was lucky to work for these two Fortune 500s. And till this day, I carry the inspiration. With Procter & Gamble, yes, there was a core model, I forgot it now, but the purpose, vision, values, and principles and how that cascades. But I remember very well when I was in sales, business development, that group, that subgroup or business unit had its way of living the values. So yes, same values, yes, same leadership principles, but also there was a touch to it. The way sales was role modeling it was a bit different than manufacturing or right how they were role modeling it. But there was acknowledgement that yes, we have a corporate culture. This is it. And this is our way of living it in our business unit. But there was still a sense of alignment with its own spices. So it was okay to have, and this is something I acknowledge with leaders, it's okay that there are subcultures as long as there's alignment. But then there's the idea of what it's also called in the literature, maybe hotspots or watch out areas. It's for to keep eyes on those and right. So help areas which need to be managed, but learn from also the good spots inside. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah. And that's where I would go to, whether it's the values or the leadership expectations or the performance expectations, right? Definitely the good spots we should highlight and say, here's an area where they're performing really well. It's got to be tied to performance in an organization, obviously. Like here's where people in an organization are aligned completely, with the values, they're espousing them. The way they do it is kind of cool and exciting, and they're delivering great results. That's what you would hope is the outcome in that. And that should be celebrated. Absolutely. And used in examples, because often, I think I mentioned earlier, some leaders know how to do it and some leaders don't. So sharing best practices and successes are really a great thing. And we don't do enough of that. In the areas where we're not aligned, this is where I think the quote about, accountability or trust doesn't thrive in an organization or doesn't thrive without accountability. So if I see an area where, the culture, the behaviors aren't aligned with where we want to be in the values of the organization, I don't know how trust can thrive in that, because if we're not holding that organization area or leader accountable, and accountability doesn't mean consequence or punishment, it could be corrective action and resetting expectation. That could be development, but it's really important that we don't ignore it. It's a good thing. Let's shine the spotlight and let's dig in and help.
Exactly.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Leading with Culture. I wanted to share what we do at Maslow Leadership in a minute. Many leaders are expected to manage culture, but are not equipped to lead with culture. At Maslow, we provide culture analytics, culture training, and coaching on how to lead with culture. In other words, we provide research and data-driven culture and leadership transformation. Our corporate programs include research in the design, where we measure the pre- and post-impact of our leadership and coaching programs. We have 3 pillars of our work. Number 1, culture transformation. Our research on the changing employee needs in the post-COVID era created a brand new approach called culture actualization. The employee engagement measures and systems we're currently using were designed 10 to 20 years before and are not capturing the needs of this post-COVID era. Leadership development. Leading with Culture and Leader as a Coach are our signature programs helping leaders on this next chapter. Number 3, coaching. We develop large-scale corporate coaching programs and offer ICF-accredited coach certifications. Reach out to us to get more information at maslowleadership.com.
Now, here's an interesting fact that we found in our research in the last 2 years is that most organizations primarily see culture as the North Star, the values, behaviors, and that is definitely the North Star, the aspirational direction. What we found in our research is that from employees' point of view, unless employees' basic needs and psychological needs are met, there's a sense of feeling disconnected to that North Star. So what we found was that it's almost like our three circles in our model, like the living values is the third circle. It's a place of self-actualization, but there are some like prerequisites to get there for embodying values across the organization with basic needs and psychological needs. So any last thoughts on that, maybe?
No, I couldn't agree more with that thought and that sentiment and that experience that employees have, and unless those basic needs aren't being met. But I also go to, if you break down the elements of culture, and we talked about personal relationships, like trust and personal relationships. So I just can't help but imagine how we step into those basic needs with employees, how we have conversations about what that is and be open and listen and go in with a learner's mindset and with humility, which I think shapes, the culture that you want. So I think it's an and. That's all.
And connection is one of the strong elements of culture, because we know that it's not about the perks, it's not about the foosball, it's how people experience each other, their colleagues, their leaders. So that's very well said. Thank you, Tammy. Well, in our last kind of few questions, and going back to our name, Leading with Culture, what would be some reminders for leaders more on the business units, frontline? Like, how can a leader, a manager lead with culture?
I've been giving this a lot of thought about, do you lead with culture? Is culture the outcome of how you lead? Tell us more. I think at times when we come in and it's very academic, and I might come in from my ivory tower out to the business, and we're going to, talk about culture today. It doesn't mean anything or resonate. What means something to them is in the everyday. Like, did I do my work well? Do I understand what my work is? Do I have a good relationship with my peers? Did my boss check in on me? Those things. So I think about the leading aspect, or just the employee relationship that we have with each other, like those behaviors are driven by the set of assumptions, so that will drive the culture. But even if I harp on culture and lead with it, it's not going to change a thing if people aren't going to change how they behave every day, and then the system around them. So it's just a slight nuance. I believe absolutely in leading with culture. I just think you need to lead to get the culture that you want.
That is a very, very good point. And in simpler terms, it's in the genuine relationships, the trust building, the listening, the connection, where you have the strongest probably levers of building culture, or whether it's an input or output. That's a great reminder. Now, we have amongst our listeners and our coach certification program participants, we have a lot of HR practitioners, and some of them say whether they're not always in positions of power, but they want to influence the organization. So what would be your suggestions to HR business partners, HR managers, HR directors who are on the path? Like, how can they support the culture transformation from within?
I suspect that there's many HR partners around this table and who will be listening that probably undervalue the point of view that they bring to the table. And so their power is likely in speaking up, and their perspective and their point of view more often. And I put myself in that bucket early days. And I've learned the more that I've brought a position, a great question, a perspective, a sentiment. How do employees feel? How does this impact performance? If they show up and feel this. So when I started to ask tough questions, when I started to actually share my perspective and point of view from an employee perspective, or from an organizational behavior or system perspective, it actually resonated. And the more it resonated, the more I spoke up, and the more I spoke up, the more I was asked to be part of the conversations. But it takes courage to bring a different perspective, and depends what type of industry you're in. If you're in a knowledge-based industry, that might be harder. When you're in an industrial industry, where sometimes you're just talking about the physical assets, to bring up a people or feeling in a conversation might be a little bit more challenging. But it is absolutely necessary. And I have to tell you, it is appreciated. And that's my experience here, is that it is welcomed and appreciated, and not always understood first off, but understood that that's a good question. Haven't thought about that. So ask it. Bring your perspective. It's valuable and needs to be heard.
Yes, building that courage, being brave to speak up and share. And I strongly believe, and our followers know, and how much we believe in empowering HR. And I see we're going to humanize the workplace, build more people and performance-focused organizations. HR people and culture has an incredibly critical role. And I'm noticing the way leaders need to build coaching and mentorship skills. It's part of the future skills of work. HR leaders also and HR practitioners need to build their coaching and mentorship skills. So that's something I support and encourage them to keep building and learning about coaching and mentorship and consulting. And as Josh Burson reminds, like the people and culture leaders, they're becoming internal advisors, internal consultants to their leaders.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a great skill. You're absolutely right. Plant the seeds, right? Coach, advise, learn how to do that. That is a very, very useful skill.
Exactly. Well, Tammy, I mentioned this to you too as well. I have some leaders in large organizations that inspire me with the work they do. They give me hope that what we're doing in terms of working towards humanizing organizations, it's not just a utopia. And you're one of those leaders that are working on the front end of driving change, transformation, and towards a people-focused organization. I'd like to thank you for, again, joining our podcast and sharing your thoughts. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Pleasure speaking with you, Tim, and I look forward to many more conversations along this line and any other way that I can help or, be involved in your work. I'd love that.
Thank you so much, Tammy. I appreciate that. Thanks.